Hello. So in this video, we're going to do something a little bit different than we normally do. I'm going to jump in on the Roald Dahl editing controversy. This is something that's big news right now. Probably in 3 months it won't be, but right now it happens to be at time of filming, beginning of March 2023. So for those of you who haven't heard this story, basically what's happening is that the publisher and the estate of Roald Dahl, the children's author and also just weirdo, are making realistically comparatively minor edits to many of Roald Dahl's books, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, for instance. And they're releasing new versions of them that have some of the slightly more offensive content stripped out. This has generated a ton of controversy. Now, some of the controversy is definitely in bad faith, especially coming from the political right, who, let's face it, don't give a shit about literature, don't give a shit about the arts, don't give a shit about high culture or whatever it is. Anyway, what they want is the ability to offend people without being criticized for offending people. So there's a whole branch of this debate that I think is just in bad faith anyway. One of the big criticisms from the right, especially, that I do want to address is the idea that this is woke censorship. No, it's absolutely not. And actually, this is kind of the problem that I have with the changes being made to Roald Dahl's work. It's just blatant capitalist chicanery. That's all there is to it. The publishers and the estate realized that they could make more money, they could sell more copies if the books were less offensive. But I think, and I don't know this for sure, I think they also helped kick up a lot of the dust about this because they could also make more money if people were like, no, we demand the old offensive versions. And sure enough, in this fucking new Coke, classic Coke bullshit capitalist sales move, they pretty much immediately announced that they were going to be releasing classic editions or whatever the fuck they're calling it. So their whole goal with this was very clearly, the emerging demographic of millennial and Gen Z parents, and there's, I think, some elder Gen Z are getting to be the age where they may be parents, but they will be parents in the relatively near future. Millennial and Gen Z parents are less likely to have their kids read books that are fatphobic, that are racist, that are homophobic, that are gender exclusionary, whatever it is. And so if you want to sell to that market, then you edit the books to take some of those things out. Simple, straightforward capitalism. They want to sell to people who don't want to buy products that have these themes in them. So you take some of those themes out, and we'll talk about what exactly taking those themes out looks like, because I actually think this is a bullshit part of the debate as well. But you release new editions that don't do those things that people won't want to read to their children. But then you can also say, it's big controversy. We're releasing the old versions with the offensive stuff in it so that you people who are just really desperate to read offensive stuff that doesn't add anything to the actual storyline or develop the characters in any way, you can be happy about it. It is about selling books. I mean, the reality is there's no good reason for there to be controversy about this at all. If they want to release slightly edited versions, fine. The old versions are still available. It isn't like new Coke, right? Like, if people drank all of the old Coke and Coca-Cola was only manufacturing new Coke, sure, you would no longer be able to get old Coke, but books don't work that way. I guarantee you there are free versions of Roald Dahl's books with all the offensive stuff you could want on the internet. You can find them for free. I guarantee it. It literally makes no difference to whether or not someone has access to the original work. And it's not even the original work. That's worth saying as well. I'll talk about that later because that's another thing that I think is a problem with the people who are critical of this move. But I want to talk about the actual changes that are being made here. From what I've seen reported, and I haven't read these new books, I haven't read the older versions of Roald Dahl's book, I'm not that interested in him. Doesn't seem like the changes really matter. So, I mean, that's part of the reason I say there shouldn't be any debate about this at all. It seems like they're just bullshit minor changes that don't do anything in reality. It's like one of the big examples that a lot of people have been pointing to is with the description of Augustus Kloop in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. They're going from describing him as enormously fat, which is what the original printed version says, to just describing him as enormous. So what? It doesn't make any difference. They mean the same thing. You're just taking out the word fat. I don't see any good reason for making that change. And so that's part of the reason I say this is blatant capitalist chicanery, is it doesn't actually do anything. There's no substantive change being made here. And in fact, even if you take out the word fat, it doesn't change that the storyline of Augustus Kloop is this person is bad because of their unashamed gluttony. You're not making the story less fat-phobic. The story itself continues to be fat-phobic, whether or not the word fat is in there. It doesn't change anything. It's a pointless change. And my sense is that's kind of across the board here. This is one of those very much performative shifts. And I actually think performative gestures can be really, really important. But in this case, I mean performative in the sense that they're like, hey, look, we're being inclusive, but we're actually not. Like, and I think that's a big, big difference between something like what's happening with Roald Dahl's books and something like Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, which is another big one that people often talk about in terms of censoring an author, in censoring in scare quotes, because it's not really censorship. But in terms of censoring an author for content that we now find problematic. Roald Dahl's project with Augustus Kloop is fat phobia. It is to say, gluttony is wrong. People who eat too much are bad and should be made fun of. There is a positive moral way to spin that, which is moderation and self-control and things like that. But it's also very clearly shame this person for eating as much as they want to eat. That's, in my view, a negative message. Now, we take a book like Huckleberry Finn. This is an anti-racist book. This is an anti-slavery book. Twain was himself famously anti-racist. He was a supporter of African American rights. When he creates Jim, this is not to mock black people. This is not to caricature slaves. This is to point out how fucking stupid and horrible racism was and is in the US. So, in that sense, changing the description in that book from N-word Jim to slave Jim, which is one of the common changes that people make, actually seems to me to align with Twain's project, right? Because Twain's project is an anti-racist project. He would want people engaging with these anti-racist ideas. And if people are not reading the book because it has the N-word throughout, then you've lost the anti-racism element. What Twain was trying to do has fundamentally been sabotaged. But what he was trying to do was fundamentally positive for society. Whereas what Dahl is trying to do is not necessarily positive for society, but the change being made here, taking out the word fat and just describing Augustus as enormous, doesn't sabotage that project at all. So I think there's a big difference there in terms of whether or not this change actually matters, and whether or not it matters particularly to the project that the author's work is engaged on. And I think with Roald Dahl, it doesn't make any difference. I think if you say enormously fat or just enormous, the lesson of Augustus Gloop is unchanged. Whereas when you say N-word Jim and people say, I'm not reading this, that's racist, then the anti-racist element of the novel is literally lost. It is gone. You don't get it anymore. Whereas if you adjust that to say Slave Jim and people say, okay, that's problematic, but I can read this and I can get the anti-racist lesson here, then you've fucking done Mark Twain a service. You have literally helped him get his message out there, as opposed to being pointlessly offensive in such a way that people don't read it. So that's kind of ultimately the thing for me. So I was watching Big Joel's commentary on the Roald Dahl case in terms of on his Little Joel channel. And one of the things that he had said, so he takes a very different attitude toward this than I do. I like Big Joel a lot, but on this we are at odds. What he says essentially is, if you don't like the offensive material in a book, just read a different book. And that, to me, seems like the rub. That seems like the problem. Depending on your perspective, I suppose. Because the reality is, sure, that can work. But if we agree as a society, I guess, that a work is worth preserving, then isn't it implicitly worth reading? But if we're not going to read it because it's offensive, then what have we achieved? So let's take the Mark Twain example again. Let's say we pass an ironclad global law that can never be violated, that every version of Huckleberry Finn ever printed must say N-word Jim. Any copy that does something different will be destroyed, and the people who printed it jailed. Fine. Now, millennials, Gen Z parents, we all collectively say, I don't really want my children reading the N-word repeatedly, over and over and over and over and over. So we stop encouraging our children to read Huckleberry Finn. It falls out of school curricula because teachers don't want to teach it. People basically stop reading it. The people who read it are people like me, who are literary scholars, who have this particular interest. But Mark Twain ceases to be a central part of the American canon. What have we achieved? Yes, we have preserved the version of Mark Twain's book in which there is a racist term that was in common use at the time and is now considered extraordinarily offensive, but no one is reading it. Congratulations. You have saved a book and destroyed its ability to get its message out there, destroyed its utility as a piece of literature. That's the thing that I think is fundamentally missed with the, just read a different book if you're offended argument. If that book is worth preserving, then it is worth reading. And if we're not going to read it, then it doesn't make any fucking difference if we preserve it in its original form or not. It doesn't matter. If nobody is reading Huckleberry Finn, if nobody is reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, if nobody is reading whatever particular book it is, because it has offensive language that is not crucial, particularly that's not crucial to the plot or the theme, then what's the point of it? What does it matter? Let's fucking take out everything in Mark Twain. Let's just leave the first 5 words and call it Mark Twain. It doesn't make any difference if no one's reading it. It has the same use value. So that's why I don't think it matters that much. If the goal is, let us produce versions of this work that people will actually read, isn't that more worthwhile than let us preserve an arbitrarily selected version of this that no one is going to read? And I say an arbitrarily selected version of this because that is the other element that people often ignore with this. The version that got printed is a version. And there's a lot of other versions. I've published a book. I've published articles. I've written stuff for at various levels of publication, from scholarly work to popular work. I've written things that have gone into newspapers. I've written things that have gone online. There are multiple versions of almost everything that I've ever written. Probably in high school, I wrote some papers. Probably in undergrad, I wrote some papers that I didn't do much revision to. There's my doctoral dissertation. There's so many versions of it. Some have big changes, some have minor changes. An article that I just sent out the other day, there are probably 6 different versions of it with different degrees of how much revision has been done to it. This is how publishing works. This is how writing works. You write multiple versions of it. The version that gets published is a combination of the author's final set of revisions with the editorial choices made or imposed by the editor. There's nothing magical. There's nothing sacred about that final version of the text. And the idea that there is an extraordinarily modern idea. If you go back, for instance, to the time of Shakespeare, I'm not a specialist in this, but I love early modern printing conventions, Tudor and Jacobean era printing conventions. If you look at the works of Shakespeare, right, there's a lot of people, and I was in theater for a little bit. People sometimes have this impression that Shakespeare is sacred, right? The text can't, like, there are people who will insist you must memorize it word for word, and every word in your performance must be exactly the word that Shakespeare wrote. But it isn't. It isn't the word that Shakespeare wrote at all, necessarily. We don't know what Shakespeare wrote. What Shakespeare would have written was a copy that was owned by the theater company. Shakespeare, in the Elizabethan era, in the Jacobean era, Shakespeare would have had no conception that he owned his plays. The theater company he wrote for owned the plays. And they were printed, sometimes without that theater's consent, from pirated editions, because other theaters would pirate copies of these plays, and then they would put on the plays themselves, and they would often be very different from the original. So if you look at Hamlet, there's 4 different early printings, I think. There's the first quarto, there's the first folio, the second quarto, and the third quarto, I think, are the 4 different early printings of Hamlet, and they all are different. They all vary. I think Q1, the first quarto, doesn't even include the most famous line in English literature, to be or not to be. It doesn't have that soliloquy at all. The idea that the published version is a sacred text that can never be altered in any way, it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, it is sort of this blatant, I don't know, it's this sort of almost quasi-religious attitude. And actually, a lot of people have that notion toward books as well. I'm a book person. I'm a literature scholar, a drama scholar. I have hundreds of books, probably. The idea that you can't write in them, you can't dog-ear the pages, you can't mark things up, whatever it is bullshit. The book is a physical object. There's nothing inherently sacred about this object. Yeah, I might have a nice copy that I want to preserve because I view it as an art object. Personally, I don't, but a lot of book collectors do. But there's nothing inherently sacred about it. The idea that a text or a physical book cannot be changed or altered because that's somehow insulting to the author to me, it is completely divorced from the actual writing process. I mean, the whole process of writing is negotiating with words, right? And if an author or publishers or the estate of an author want to renegotiate with those words, that is the writing process. And sure, I am sympathetic to the idea that Roald Dahl didn't approve these changes. Fine. But Roald Dahl did already make changes to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. He did already make changes to every book that he ever wrote. Some of those changes he chose to make. Some of those changes were made at the exhortation of publishers, because that is also part of the writing process. I think a great example of this is Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, one of my favorite Victorian novels. Dickens wrote this, he wrote the ending of it, and his publisher was like, that sucks. Nobody wants this ending. He originally wrote a sad ending. And the publisher was like, go back and write a happy ending, because that's what people want. That's what readers want. So Dickens went back, scrapped the ending that he had originally written, the ending that he wanted, and he wrote a happy ending because it would sell. Because his publisher said, this is what will sell, this is what you're going to do. Now, today, many printed editions of Great Expectations are printed with both endings. You get the original ending and the happy ending. Which one comes first depends on the publisher. Dickens never meant for the book to be read that way. He did not intend for both of those endings to be read side by side. That's a choice that editors have made to give contemporary readers a fuller picture of the book. Would Dickens approve? I don't know. Who gives a shit? He wrote both. Both are proper endings to Great Expectations, and in that sense, neither is the proper ending to Great Expectations. Because both are the right ending, and both make sense with the novel, it's impossible to say this is the ending of Great Expectations. That's a very overt example, but I mean, another one, you take something like Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. He released different editions of it throughout his life because he revised it. Which is the version of Leaves of Grass? There isn't one. You can't say there's this definitive edition. The same principle applies. And part of the reason I say the same principle applies is because often publishing contracts include language allowing the editor to change a certain amount of the book for republication. I don't know what Dahl's publishing contracts looked like, but if they were fairly standard publishing contracts, that would not be unusual, that the editor would reserve the right to make changes to the book in order to sell more copies. This is, again, a standard component of how the capitalist publishing industry functions. I don't see any real reason to get upset about this. Again, I think it would be a different thing if it were going to be, we're fundamentally rewriting Augustus Kloop's character. He's no longer going to be shamed. We are completely dismantling what Dahl was doing, and we're going to somehow find and destroy every copy of our pre-changed works. But that isn't what's happening. That isn't the world we live in. And it's a fucking tempest in a teacup. Who gives a shit? If you want to read the old version, read the old version. If you want to read the new version, read the new version. And the thing is, if what it comes down to for me is, if that work is worth reading, then it is worth reading. And if the question is, and if the demand is, we must have this word fat in there, even though it does nothing to serve the plot, then we're not going to read it. Then it is going to be a relic in a museum, forgotten by the majority of the reading public. Congratulations, you've saved it for the dustbin of history.